Hi, this is Jasmine from the YouTube channel a long time ago. Today I'll be guest narrating for useful charts in order to show you the family tree of the Anglo-Saxon monarchs. In Matt's video on the British monarchy, he started with Alfred the Great and then traced the line all the way back down to Queen Elizabeth II. But we can actually trace the royal line several hundred years further back. You see, prior to the emergence of the Kingdom of England, Alfred's ancestors ruled over a kingdom known as the Kingdom of Wessex. Wessex was just one of 7 Anglo-Saxon kingdoms that existed in England prior to, well, England. So today I'm going to show you the family tree of some of the most important monarchs who ruled during the Anglo-Saxon period. Let's start with some background. From 43 to 410 CE, the area now known as England was a province of the Roman Empire called Britannia, and it was mostly inhabited by a group of Celtic people known as the Britons. However, in the year 406, things started to change. In that year, Germanic armies crossed the Rhine River for the first time and started to take over the Western Roman Empire. By the year 410, the Romans were no longer able to keep troops in Britain and therefore abandoned the province. Sometime after this, Germanic tribes started to invade the shores of Great Britain, although there is evidence that some Germanic peoples arrived before this time as well. These Germanic invaders came from 3 main tribes: the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes. It is from the Angles and the Saxons that we get the term Anglo-Saxon, and from the Angles that we get the word English. Over time, through a process of migration and assimilation, the language and culture of the area went from being primarily Brittonic to being primarily Anglo-Saxon, with many Britons being pushed into what is today Wales. Eventually, 7 main Anglo-Saxon kingdoms emerged: the Anglic kingdoms of Northumbria, Mercia and East Anglia, the Saxon kingdoms of Wessex, Essex and Sussex, meaning West Saxons, East Saxons and South Saxons, and the Jutish kingdom of Kent. This is why this period is also sometimes called the Heptarchy, meaning the 7 kings. In reality, though, there was never a time in which all 7 kingdoms were equally strong. For example, throughout much of the Anglo-Saxon period, Mercia was the dominant power, and then, eventually, it was Wessex. Okay, let's now return to the family tree. At the top you can see the names of the 7 kings who are credited with having established the royal lines associated with each of the 7 kingdoms. On this chart, yellow represents the 3 Anglic kingdoms, red the 3 Saxon kingdoms, and purple the single Jutish kingdom. However, please note that the coats of arms you see above each line did not actually exist at the time. Heraldry wasn't really a thing until 600 years later, during the High Middle Ages. So each of the shields you see here are simply later inventions that were attributed back to the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, long after they were gone. Another later invention that was attributed back to the early Anglo-Saxon kings was the title of Bretwalda, which literally means Britain ruler, and which was kind of a similar title to that of High King. Although the title probably didn't exist initially, later chronicles assigned it to the various Anglo-Saxon kings who were thought to have been the dominant ones. So, for example, the first 4 Bretwalders were said to have been Alla of Sussex, Cheolin of Wessex, Athelbert of Kent, and Radwald of East Anglia. King Athelbert of Kent is notable in that he was the first Anglo-Saxon king to convert to Christianity. This was largely due to the fact that he married a Merovingian princess, the woman now known as Saint Berta. However, his actual conversion is credited to Saint Augustine of Canterbury, not to be confused with the more famous Saint Augustine of Hippo. Note that the current leader of the Church of England is known as the Archbishop of Canterbury, a title that traces its origins back to the Augustine who converted Athelbert. Athelbert was also supposedly a direct descendant of Hengist, Hengist and Horsa being the 2 legendary brothers who are said to have led the initial Anglo-Saxon invasion. For the remainder of this video we are going to focus on the 3 largest Anglo-Saxon kingdoms: Mercia, Wessex and Northumbria. Let's start with Northumbria. Northumbria was originally 2 kingdoms, Bernicia and Deira. However, Bernicia and Deira eventually merged due to a rather messy sequence of events. To explain, let's start around the year 600, which happens to be around the time that King Athelbert of Kent became the first Anglo-Saxon king to convert to Christianity. Around this time, the king of Bernicia was a man named Athelfrith. and the king of Deira was a man named Athelric. The exact details are unclear, but it seems that Athelfrith eventually conquered Deira, perhaps killing Athelric in the process. This led to Athelric's brother Edwin being exiled, where he eventually wound up in the court of King Radwald of East Anglia. Athelfrith thus became the first king of both Bernicia and Deira. However, after about a decade of ruling over both kingdoms, Athelfrith was attacked by the armies of Radwald. Radwald killed Athelfrith and placed his ally Edwin on the throne instead, thus making Edwin the second king to rule both Bernicia and Deira. Around the same time, King Athelbert of Kent died, leaving Radwald as the most powerful king and hence the new Bretwalda. I should also point out that Radwald is thought to have been the owner of the Sutton Hoo helmet, an ornately decorated helmet found in a ship grave during an archaeological excavation in 1939. Anyway, Edwin eventually married the daughter of Athelbert of Kent, and as a result, he too converted to Christianity. When Radwald died, Edwin became the fifth Bretwalda, but fighting continued between the kingdoms, and eventually Edwin was killed by King Penda of Mercia, who had allied with the Welsh king Cadwallon. At this point, Bernicia and Deira were once again split into two kingdoms, with Edwin's kinsman Osric taking Deira, and Athelfrith's son, Eanfrith, taking Bernicia. Note that Athelfrith had actually married Edwin's sister, Atcha, and thus Eanfrith was Edwin's nephew. However, the Welsh king Cadwallon continued to attack Bernicia and Deira, and eventually managed to kill both Osric and Eanfrith. Later chroniclers would blame this on the fact that both Osric and Eanfrith had reverted their lands back to paganism. The stage was thus set for the sixth Bretwalda, Eanfrith's brother Oswald. During Edwin's reign, both Eanfrith and Oswald had been exiled to Scotland, where they converted to Christianity. But unlike Eanfrith, who dropped his new faith upon becoming king, Oswald remained Christian. According to legend, he stuck a large wooden cross in the ground before a battle against Cadwallon, and for this reason was able to win back both Bernicia and Deira. Whether or not this is actually true, what is true is that during his reign Christianity became firmly entrenched in England. After his death, Bernicia and Deira were split for one final time. Oswin, son of Osric, took Deira, and Oswy, brother of Oswald, took Bernicia. But eventually Oswy had Oswin killed, and managed to take hold of Deira. Thus, in the year 654, Bernicia and Deira were formally merged to create the Kingdom of Northumbria, under the rule of Oswy. In order to cement the deal, Oswy married Eanflad, the daughter of Saint Edwin. Thus, Oswy became the seventh and final Bretwalda. However, the main thing Oswy is remembered for is defeating Penda, king of Mercia, at the Battle of Wynward. Penda was the last major pagan king to rule over an Anglo-Saxon kingdom, and his death at the Battle of Wynward is seen as the end of pre-Christian England. Oswy was followed by Edgefrith, a son of Eanflad, and then by Aldfrith, a son by his second wife, Finn, who was an Irish princess. Aldfrith married Cuthber, sister of King Ina of Wessex, and together with her had Osred, and possibly Osric. Osric was the last king from the main line of Northumbrian kings. After his death, the throne passed to various, more distant relatives, starting with Ceolwulf. It was in Northumbria during the reign of Ceolwulf that the famous monk known as the Venerable Bede lived. Bede's many writings are arguably the most important sources for the Anglo-Saxon period. In fact, he is considered to be one of the most important historians from early Christian Europe. Okay, at this point let's turn our attention to the Kingdom of Mercia, which was located just below Northumbria. The word Mercia comes from the word march, which at the time simply meant the borderlands. In Mercia's case, the name likely referred to the border between the Anglo-Saxons and the Britons. So initially its rulers were simply the leaders of the border folk, but eventually the area evolved into a kingdom that was officially known as Mercia. Their line starts with a man named Ichel, who, unlike all other Anglo-Saxon kings, actually had royal roots back on the continent. He is said to have been the son of the last Anglic king of Germany. However, please keep in mind that the early genealogy for all of these families is a bit sketchy, and therefore should be taken with a grain of salt. For example, most of the Anglo-Saxon genealogies list all of these kings as going all the way back to the god Woden, who is known in Norse mythology as Odin. The first really powerful king of Mercia was Penda, who I've already mentioned as being the last major pagan king from any of the 7 Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. However, after Penda's death, his sons converted to Christianity. Peade was the first to rule, but he did was split for one final time. Oswin, son of Osric, took Gyra, but Oswald took Veni.
Hello everyone, my name's Yusef, and welcome to Animize. If there's one truism about anime opening and closing songs we can all agree on, it's their eclectic nature. Obviously, anime has its trends, but in the grand scheme of things, a very large diversity of genres are represented, which is part of the reason why we love them. It's ironic then that among such a diversity, that an enormous amount of OPs and EDs use the exact same chord progression. No, seriously, the exact same chord progression. So today I'm going to talk about how this simple chord progression forms the backbone of a large amount of anime opening and closing songs. I'll also discuss where it comes from and why it's become a staple in anime music and Japanese composition in general. The progression we'll be looking at today is called a 4-5-6 minor or a flat 6, flat 7, 1 minor. And it's everywhere in the anime OP world. You probably noticed I gave the progression two names. That's because the name will change depending on whether you're using the progression in a major or minor key. For simplicity's sake, we'll go with the major scale spelling, but just keep in mind that every song is technically a different situation. So without further ado, let's listen to some examples.
この思いを消してしまうにはまだ人生長いでしょう君だよ君なんだよ教えてくれた
And modularity. For this reason, there are many commonly used variations of the chord progression. So even though the progression is, at its core, a 3-chord progression, a 4th chord is often added in certain spots to change how it sounds and functions within the context